Good evening. I welcome you all. My name is Satya Pulkuri, and I'm the Associate Editor of Indic Researchers Forum. I'm currently a Master candidate at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS. I'm doing my specialization in cyber threat intelligence and cyber investigations and machine learning. Uh, I welcome you all to the fourth session, which is weaponization of academic institutions and human rights. The session chair will be Ms. Aarti Tikoo Singh. She's the editor-in-chief of the New Indian. She was the former Foreign and Security Affairs editor at IANS. She has previously worked with Times of India and Hindustan Times, and she has nearly 2 decades of experience in conflict reporting, including extensive coverage of the Kashmir conflict. A native of Kashmir, Miss Tikoo grew up and studied in Jammu after forcible displacement of a religious minority community from Kashmir in 1990. She received a master's in international affairs from Columbia University in New York, where she worked briefly at the Columbia University, the United Nations, and the BBC. In 2002, she returned to Kashmir as journalist and has since been reporting on the conflict. Besides Kashmir, she has also been reported from other conflict zones in India. She has also written about the Islamist radicalization, terrorism, and human rights abuses in other parts of India. And her work has been featured in a range of national and international publications. She has been a recipient of several awards for her research and reporting and editorial accomplishments. Thank you for joining, ma'am. With your permission, I'll be introducing all the panelists for the session.
All right.
So, yeah. The first speaker would be Sri Rajiv Malhotra. Malhotra ji was trained physicist and then as a computer scientist specializing in AI in 1970s. After a successful corporate career in the United States, he has become an entrepreneur and founded and ran several IT companies in 20 countries. He exited all for-profit activities in the early 1990s as a founder of his non-profit organization, Infinity Foundation in Princeton, United States. He has, on a full-time basis, has been researching civilization from a historical, social sciences, and mind sciences perspective. He has authored several best-selling books, and Infinity Foundation has also published a 14-volume series on history of the Indian science and technology. Many other books are in the pipeline and will be completed in due course. He has also served as the chairman of the board of governors of the Center for Indic Studies at the University of Massachusetts and is on the advisory board of the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. Sir will be discussing about the globalism and takeover of social justice. Our second speaker for the session is Dr. Michael Rubin. Dr. Rubin is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specializes in Iran, Turkey, and broader Middle East region. A former Pentagon official, Dr. Rubin has lived in the post-revolution Iran, Yemen, and both pre and post-war Iraq. He has spent time with Taliban before 9/11. For more than a decade, he taught classes at the sea about the Horn of Africa and Middle Eastern conflicts, cultures, terrorism, to deployed by the United States Navy and the Marine Corps units. Dr. Rubin is the author, co-author, and co-editor of several books exploring diplomacy, Iranian history, Arab culture, Kurdish studies, and Shiite politics, including Seven Pillars: What Really Causes Instability in the Middle East, Kurdish Uprising. And other book is Dancing with Devil: The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes, and also Eternal Iran Continuity and Chaos. Dr. Rubin has a PhD and MA in history from Yale University, where he also obtained a Bachelor of Science in Biology. He'll be discussing completely about the weaponization of human rights, subversion of the NGOs, and the United Nations. And our next speaker is Mr. Samir Kalra. He is the Managing Director of Policies and Program and Co-Legal Counsel at Hindu American Foundation. Mr. Kalra has worked on a wide range of legal advocacy issues, including religious accommodations, First Amendment rights, hate crimes, human rights, and Hindu phobia. He has also oversees the foundation's local, state, federal, and international policy initiatives, and has also authored formal testimony for dozens of US congressional hearings. Mr. Kalra has been widely published in MOD Corporate of Governance and Accountability Review Law Journal, The Hill, The National Interest, The Capital Week, First Post, and Swarajya. He holds a Juris Doctorate from Santa Clara University School of Law and is admitted to practice law before the California State Bar and the United States District Court of Central District of California. Sir will be discussing and decoding the CAA and the Launtenberg Amendment. And thank you, sir, for joining. And now I invite the last speaker, Major General Dr. G.D. Bakshi, Sena Medal, Vishishta Seva Medal, retired. He is a combat veteran of many skirmishes on the line of control and the counterterrorism operations in Jammu and Kashmir and Punjab. He commanded his battalion in active operations in Kargil and was awarded Vishishta Seva Medal. Later, he commanded a brigade in counterterrorism operations in Kishtwar and was awarded Sena Medal. He subsequently commanded the Romeo Force during the intensive counterterrorism operations in Rajouri, Panch districts of Jammu and Kashmir. He has served at the highly prestigious Director General of Military Operations during Operation Pavan and Operation Vijay. He is a prolific writer on matter of military and non-military and has published over 40 books and over 200 papers in many prestigious research journals. He served as a deputy director research at the VIF. He has subsequently took over the chief editor of the Defense and Security Alert magazine. He is currently editor of the Indian Military Review. Sir will be discussing about the caste and national security, Western intervention in the India's social fabric. Now I request the session chair to hand over the floor. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you, Indic Research Forum, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to speak on a very vital subject, especially alongside such veterans of the army and also of public service. It's an honor and privilege. Let me first begin with extending my heartfelt condolences to all the families who have suffered in Israel, in Palestine, in Ukraine, and world over in the last 5 years. First, of course, because of the coronavirus pandemic, and later because of the wars which are ongoing in Ukraine and Gaza. And I started my this session with condolences because I feel somewhere we've all been weaponized, and probably in some areas inadvertently and some areas very consciously, we've been all weaponized. And we need to we need to really focus on what this weaponization is. To begin with, I would really like to ponder over what weaponization means, because sometimes a lot of people think that weaponization of love, weaponization of hatred, weaponization of plants, weaponization of animals, weaponization of almost everything is happening in the age and era that we are living in. But can everything be called weaponization? Can difference of opinion, which sometimes gets amplified because there is a mass mandate for that opinion, that point of view, is that weaponization? Or weaponization is something very specific to really weaponizing fault lines or differences within human society, to an extent where that entity or that individual or that non living thing becomes a weapon in the hands of imperialistic forces, in the hands of states, in the hands of non states, in the hands of the super state, and in the hands of global uh, globalist elite or corporate elite. I think this distinction is necessary because, as I said, now people are rampantly and recklessly, thoughtlessly using this word weaponization almost in every discourse that is happening either in social media or elsewhere. The distinction is necessary because weaponization, to my mind and to everybody's mind, should be the exploitation of or the amplification of a fault line which radicalizes either that entity or an individual or a community to an extent where it takes up arms or takes to the course of anarchy, disorder, chaos, and violence. And I think that's why I started with my condolences to all the families, to all the kith and kin of people who have lost their near and dear ones in the last 4 5 years, where we saw how a pandemic which arose from Wuhan in China. I was listening to the previous session, and somebody said that China is the biggest threat because the Wuhan virus emerged from China, and we don't even know what all is in store for entire humanity for the next, next few decades. As it seems that even germs, even diseases which humanity seemed to have conquered in the last 100 years, they are now being weaponized to an extent that we can have large scale, mass scale pandemics which can lead to mass scale destruction of human beings. Now, as a survivor of ethnic cleansing and also as a survivor of human rights violations that were inflicted on me, my community, and Kashmiri, overall Kashmiri people in Kashmir for the last 35 years. I am incidentally sitting in Kashmir today, and I am seeing a different Kashmir, which is very far, far from the Kashmir which I had seen, which was completely weaponized against the Indian state, which was weaponized against its own people, which was weaponized against Kashmiri Hindus, which led to the ethnic cleansing of the entire community from Kashmir in 1990. So, as a survivor of that ethnic cleansing and also as a journalist who's traveled the length and breadth of India, um, I think the focus on human rights and education is all the more important and relevant, even as we are discussing weaponization of human rights and education. But I think it's important, it's quite pertinent to not lose sight of the fact that human rights and education are fundamental pillars of any progressive society, of any society that aspires to become a great power, and also aspires to become a humanizing power. And I think India, through its culture, through its tradition, through its history, has always been a humanistic culture, has always believed in human rights. It has always believed in emancipation, education, and enlightenment. And those values remain intact in India, even as we are seeing weaponization of germs, we are seeing weaponization of communities along different demographics. And that, I would say, thanks to technology and openness of India as a democratic nation, that India has been believes in the idea of democracy, it believes in the idea of openness, it believes in idea of being liberal and not being closed to others, not being closed to other points of view. But at the same time, this openness has also made India quite vulnerable for weaponization, which has been done by several imperialistic powers. Among them, certainly all the superpowers, have time and again, and different points of time, weaponized uh, fault lines of Indian society, whether it were the British colonial powers, which uh, went for divide and rule policy in India, and they did not even hide it. It was almost, it was open. It was being implemented unashamedly. And since independence, I would say the Western powers, of course, headed by the United States of America, has also continued with that tradition of weaponizing different fault lines, especially caste, community, religion, also region. I mean, the latest among all these fault lines which are being weaponized against the state of India, against the people of India, is the North-South divide in India. So, why I'm talking about why I'm focused on the US, how US is weaponizing it, because I think even as other imperialistic powers, among them, which certainly I mentioned at the outset, that in Kashmir we saw how Islamists were weaponized against a community, which led to the exodus and exile of the Kashmiri Hindus. Um, that I would say that weaponization continues, but that weaponization is not being done only by Pakistan, which in fact has been doing it since the creation of Pakistan in 1947. The weaponization of Islamic ideas, Islamic thought, and Islamist and Muslim separatism is not only Pakistan's doing, but it's also being done by the United States of America for the last more than, I would say, 40, 50 years. And I am not only a witness, but I am also as an investigator who has one who testified before the US Congress in 2019. At that time, not knowing that how the US had also that congressional hearing. I think Samir Kalra would remember how that congressional hearing itself was weaponization of entire separatists who had been gathered in that hearing, how Ilhan Omar was weaponized against me, how that entire setting was also a weapon against Indians, against India, and also against the democratically elected government of India. Why this is important? Because we know that even as Pakistan was created in 1947, and when it became, it joined, or you can say it became a strategic partner of the United States of America under the garb of human rights and under the garb of education. The US continually kept funding charities in Pakistan. Of course, the facade was that of promoting and propagating human rights, but that funding which went into the charities in Pakistan eventually ended up propagating cross-border terrorism in Kashmir, and also that which eventually led to human rights lobbies in Kashmir, with lot of funding coming via Pakistan, via other Hawala channels, but fundamentally were funded by the US. And leave aside even the US. In fact, I can mention all the names of all the charities which are being funded by the US, which eventually were used for terrorism in Kashmir, or in the name of Islam and in the name of Kashmir. But I can also remind all the listeners today about George Soros, who heads a noble institution with a noble intent, uh, uh, openly claiming, openly, in fact, threatening that in India, I'm just quoting him actually, that in India, democratically elected Narendra Modi is creating a Hindu nationalist state, imposing punitive measures on Kashmir, a semi autonomous Muslim region, and threatening to deprive millions of Muslims of their citizenship. Now, George Soros, who seems to be completely ignorant, but has clearly the same kind of colonial attitude and a sense of supremacy. He, with all his half-baked knowledge about India and zero experience of learning anything from India or anything from the ground in India, had the audacity to say that he was going to put billions of dollars into, and he did not use the word weaponization, but fundamentally into radicalizing the youth in India on the lines, on about the view that he holds about India. Now that view itself is ignorant, is half baked, and has hardly any truth in it. But when you look at that kind of funding that goes into propagating a certain view with a certain foreign policy agenda, this is called weaponization of not only academia but also human rights. Similarly, I can also quote you the example of Amnesty International, which in fact in 2020 was found guilty of remitting there was a significant amount of foreign funding remitted to Amnesty India without the approval of the government of India under FCRA rules, FCRA laws. And this Amnesty International, also, let me remind you, is the same institution, even though it brags about, fighting for the human rights of people, but it was also questioned by Geeta Sehgal, the gender head of Amnesty International several years ago, for its proximity and for, in fact, taking on board Mozambique, who was a votary of terrorism and who was in fact a detainee in one of the Guantanamo Bay jails. So, with such contentious role played by the human rights organizations, which are which were channeling money through charities from Pakistan into Kashmir and elsewhere, also charities like Amnesty International. We know human rights have been weaponized by the superpowers, by the imperialistic forces against the democratically elected governments of India and also against people of India. Apart from this, if you look at education, today Christophe Jaffrelot, who is, I think, the strongest and the most vocal ideologue against the Narendra Modi government in India. Yes, unlike George Soros, he has done his homework, he has done his research in India on RSS, on Hindu politics or Hindu right wing. But he holds a view against it, and he clearly is not a neutral voice, he clearly is not an objective voice, because if he was, then he would also factor in the fact that it is the people of India who chose the Modi government in India. It's the people of India who elected Prime Minister Narendra Modi to power in India, and you cannot dismiss that point of view. You cannot be the colonial rule. You cannot behave like the colonial ruler who thinks that the Indian people don't know what is good for them, what are the choices that they need to opt for. But it seems, given the kind of sustained campaign and systematic campaign against Modi government across academia in Europe, in the US, and also in the premier institutions of India, which have been traditionally leftist after India became independent in 1947, also because India's proximity to the then Soviet Union. And that, again, I think is weaponization of academia, because we saw how JNU erupted in anarchy, in violence. We saw how Jadavpur University also erupted in violent protests over different issues, whether it was CAA, which I think Samir Kalra will address at length, and also over farm laws, also over Rohit Vemula. We saw so many protests in the last 5 years that we are now, it is now very clear, evident that our universities have been weaponized uh, through a certain ideological indoctrination. And it is being done, it is largely being done by a certain section of academia, which is either based in Europe or in the US. But primarily today, the chief, I would say, ideologue is certainly Christophe Jaffrelot and his entire coterie of academics who are serving in universities in the US. And that also incidentally reminds me of the kind of anarchy and chaos that we are seeing at Columbia University, my own university, where I am an alumna of. And I'm seeing how Jewish students are bearing the brunt of that weaponization or radical indoctrination. By the way, radicalism is also a synonym or a euphemism of weaponization. These are similar words, and these are words uh, fundamentally aimed at radicalizing people along differences so that they become out of control. They forget their own duties and obligations to the collective, even as they should be focusing on their own individual rights. The Indian Constitution grants fundamental rights, but there is also a chapter about duties, about which it seems a lot of demographic demographics along different castes and communities and yeah, age groups, I would say, they are not really focused on fundamental duties. They don't even know what those duties really entail. And that is where the openness of India makes it much more vulnerable towards weaponization by the external forces, um, either in our universities or through human rights lobbies. I think I will stop at this because the panelists, the speakers ahead, will be speaking at length about these issues. Thank you very much.
Ma'am, please invite the speakers. You must be having
Yes.
the.
Yes. Rajiv ji, I think he has a medical appointment. Rajiv ji, please go ahead. I think you can come in first, and other speakers can follow after you're done.
Okay, well, thank you to the organizers. I apologize that I'll have to leave soon because I told them already yesterday that I have a appointment and I have to leave, and they said you go first. And so anyway, I have very little time left now for this. So I'll just summarize the main points of what I was going to tell you. Point number one, that we must know the source of all these problems. We can keep looking at the effect, complain about it, but we must know the sources. And the source is multifaceted. It is not one group of one bad guy or one ideology. I would say there are multiple nexuses, and you can loosely call them globalists. But these are not one ideology. So the global left is certainly a very important factor. The global Islam is another very important nexus. And I would also add global oligarchs, Western oligarchs, whether it's a Bill Gates or a Zuckerberg. I mean, they have a whole surveillance mentality that they want to bypass national boundaries and create a whole surveillance society because they have the AI technology, which gives them even more power to do so. And so this techno surveillance kind of a global state is their dream also. And then, of course, there is China. And these different kinds of globalists, each while they are ideologically not aligned with each other, they have a common enemy. They want to bring down the current world's order, the Bretton Woods type of U.S. structure, which has run the world pretty much since World War II. And by dismantling this, they hope that they will get the upper hand, that they will get ahead. While they, upon dismantling, they may have to fight each other first. But that's a subsequent stage which they haven't reached yet. So for now, there are multiple of these entities, each trying to dismantle. And India is one of the most precarious, most vulnerable countries for a number of reasons. While the United States is the target, the big target, and Europe, the point is they have counter movements. They have very strong intellectual movements, think tanks, and public intellectuals who are well informed. They talk about these things. India does not. I mean, I live here in Princeton, and I look at how Princeton University has been turned into a bastion by our own billionaires. There is a Chadda Center for International Studies or whatever, and they're having these conferences on India. And their conferences, the speakers they're bringing are the Breaking India type speakers. These are our own billionaires. And I just finished writing a book a year ago. We published on how Harvard has a whole lot of Breaking India nexuses, that are funded by the Indian billionaires. And I've talked to some of these billionaires, and they are doing this. So the pushback which we saw from the Jewish billionaires against the anti-Israel activities and anti-Zionism activities, good for them that they at least have people who push back. Our billionaires not only did not push back, but they actually funded some of the dismantling Hindutva and so on. And I've spoken to these people, and they will look the other side. They'll pretend they didn't know. So I could give you a whole seminar just on the Indian billionaire-funded anti-India and Hindu-phobic movements around the world. You see them in Stanford, which is funded by Ambani's. You see Harvard, which is funded by Mittal and Mahindra and Piramal and so on. You see them in the UK. You see them all over. So this is something unique to India. You don't find Chinese billionaires fighting against China. You don't find Pakistani billionaires fighting against Pakistan. You don't find Japanese billionaires funding. You don't find Middle East billionaires trying to dismantle Islam all over the world. You just don't do that. This is unique to India, and this has to be understood. Why is it a failure of democracy? Someone told me that, listen, these billionaires can't be controlled because they give funding to the political parties, and the political parties owe them a favor. So that's the kind of a issue that we need to address. As far as public intellectuals are concerned, they are reacting to what happens, and they react to it. And there are some favorite whipping boys like Soros and Rothschilds and things like that. But the problem is actually far deeper. The problem that India has to face is far deeper. It is externally, I mean, the hard power problems are Pakistan, China combined. Yes, that is very true. But as far as intellectual warfare is concerned, as far as emotional warfare is concerned, as far as disrupting the narrative, as far as disrupting the school education is concerned, these forces are far deeper. And collectively, you might think of them as globalists. And globalists are all those different forces for their own separate reasons that want to supersede the country by country world order and replace it with some kind of a global order. The Muslims would like a caliphate. That's their vision. China would like its own kind of through the Belt and Road kind of create a whole new virtual empire kind of a thing. Americans would like to hang on to the Bretton Woods and the dollar reserve currency and so forth. The leftists would like to create a Marxist disruption where people who are designated as oppressors are toppled by people who are designated as oppressed. And that oppressed category, by the way, no longer is not limited to economically oppressed and blacks, but now the Khalistanis have joined in, and now the Muslims have joined in, and now the Dalits have joined in. So this is like a big tent of everybody who says they're a victim coming together against the established order. And as I said, while the US has been the main target, India is more vulnerable because we do not have adequate pushback either from our billionaires or from our government. So this is a topic I won't go into. I don't have the time to do it now, but I have a new book coming out later this year, in the next 2-3 months, which talks about the infiltration into the government, into Niti Aayog, into the bureaucracies, into various organs of society in India, very quietly, very deep infiltrations by these kind of forces. Some of them are considered heroes, like Bill Gates. Pretty recently, there was Omidyar, considered a big hero, and we complained about him in a whole chapter in our book, Snakes in the Ganga, and now Omidyar has shut down, gone, left, made a decision that there'll be no more investments that he will make in India. But you see, this inability to anticipate, inability to think deep about where these people are coming from, what is their ideology, what is the game they're playing, means that the Indians are just reacting here and there, putting out the latest fire. I mean, we have our External Affairs, Jaishankar, brilliant guy, putting out fires very nicely, very good at that, but not proactive, not being able to anticipate where is the next thing going to come from, because that requires an investment in some deep research, which I think we're lacking. So I wanted to talk about what's going on with the anti-meritocracy movement from Harvard to dismantle the IITs. We wrote a book on that, the dismantling of IITs, and why that dismantling of IITs by putting in liberal arts education from inside and having this whole critical caste theory coming out from Harvard, Chura Jengde kind of people, and asking for repatriations, reparations. So just like there are reparations movement by blacks in the United States, now there's reparations movement echoing in India by the Dalits and the Muslims and so on. And this is why Rajiv Gandhi said that the Muslims, the minorities, should have the first shot at the allocation of resources. Where is he getting this from? It's not his own idea. These are this whole business of the oppressed having the first right to fight all the systems that the oppressors have created is a well-established international doctrine. This is behind why in the United States the Biden administration has brought in 9 million illegal immigrants across the Mexican border. 9 million in the last 3 years. This is why there is lawlessness in American cities, where people are going and rampaging, stealing things from stores, and up to $1,000 theft. The police won't even file a case because they don't want to. So this business of being against property rights, being against the rule of law, is becoming more widespread. You might think it's a weakness of democracy, perhaps, because democracy did not anticipate that its own people will turn into this kind of force that is self-disruptive. And the role of China in all this is very interesting, because China actually benefits. So in our work, we are showing, and I wanted to give you this evidence, how the Chinese are funding this in India, how they are funding through other organizations, through other NGOs, some of them at Ashoka University, some of them at various other universities, with Chinese money and Chinese footprint. They are actually funding the collection of data about vulnerabilities, fault lines in the rural areas, the people who are economically underprivileged, and minorities and conflicts and fault lines. This data is being collected. So the discussion is actually a much larger discussion, and I wish I had more time for this, but I have to apologize that I started late, and I have a as I said, this is an appointment that I cannot afford to miss. So I want to thank all of you. I'd love to keep in touch. I know Samir, I know General Bakshi. It's nice to meet Michael Rubin. I'd love to connect with you, Michael, maybe offline. I live in Princeton, and I would love to connect with you and talk about these things later on. So thank you for inviting me, and sorry for having to leave so soon, but I would like to stay in touch later on. Namaste, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that enlightening presentation. Now I will invite Mr. Michael Rubin, Senior Fellow at American Enterprise Institute. Over to you, Mr. Rubin.
Thank you so much. I'd like to begin by just asking rhetorically, what the deadliest conflict which is ongoing right now? When I often talk to audiences, they might say it's Ukraine, or that it is the so-called genocide in Gaza. In reality, it's Sudan. And I just highlight that to show just how subjective so much of the coverage of the so-called human rights community is. The same thing is true if we wanted to ask what the most systematic genocide is today, by any definition. And it's what is ongoing against the Uyghurs in China, the most industrialized genocide since the Holocaust during World War II. And again, the fact that we're not willing to talk about this more openly and with an objective lens suggests and really incriminates the human rights community and the activist community for their subjectivity and politicization. I guess I'm sensitive to this. As some of you know, I come from the Philadelphia area, and Philadelphia is where in the United States all the religious minorities from, especially from the United Kingdom, which were getting expelled for whatever it was, ended up taking root. And because the school district in Philadelphia was always on strike, when I was growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, my entire education was in the Quaker schools. And of course, the Quakers are rooted in pacifism. The Quakers are rooted in nonviolence. And increasingly, the Quakers are rooted in politicization. For me, it was a case study from inside as to how some of this works. I'll return to that in a second. But if I want to look academically and holistically at what I think some of the problem is, especially with humanitarian law, is there's a failure to define key security issues. Many of the Americans here, or those who have studied America, are familiar with the late Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart. He wrote a famous finding, or if you will, a famous brief, after the Supreme Court of the United States heard a case about obscenity. And in his brief, he said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. In security, in international relations, terrorism is much like that. We don't have an international legal definition of terrorism, which is universally embraced. According to Columbia University, or I should say the old Columbia University before its descent into ridiculousness, in 1988, there were more than 100 different definitions of terrorism at use in the Western world. By 2006, that had increased to 250 different definitions. I would guess that today, among democracies, among international organizations, and so forth, there are more than 1,000 different definitions of terrorism at play. And so for many countries, I mean, Pakistan is a case in point here, Iran is as well, that they will take an a la carte definition of terrorism. Terrorism is always wrong, they will say, as they seek diplomatic credit, unless it happens to be for a cause which they agree. So, Harakat al-Mujahideen or Taliban in Pakistan can detonate a suicide bomb in a school, but that's quote unquote resistance. But, and the same thing is true with Hamas. But if anyone conducts serious counterterrorism against armed groups which target civilians, then somehow they are blamed. It's a moral inversion. It's like George Orwell's 1984. Now, one of my other problems is that terrorism isn't the only thing that's not well defined. Humanitarian law isn't well defined. Most people I know who are serious scholars of humanitarian law will acknowledge that it is a work in progress. What I observe, however, is that too often, as people embrace humanitarian law and want it to be the only frame by which conflict is adjudicated and addressed, even by those who don't subscribe to the Geneva Conventions, those who dress in civilian clothes, those who hide in schools, and so forth. What I often find is two things. First of all, many people, human rights activists who cite international law, are essentially wanting to be international dictators. And the reason I say this is the law is always complex. It's seldom black and white. The whole reason we have courts is because prosecutors and defense lawyers argue out the minutiae and seek to see where the law applies. And more often than not, the prosecutor's case actually runs aground and is determined not to be fully applicable. However, how often do I hear a pundit or an NGO member say, this is against international law. Well, they can have an opinion, but they cannot simply be the judge and jury. One of the things I see when it comes to international law is a failure to consider precedent. Now, I understand the 2003 Iraq War and the US decision to invade Iraq is a controversial subject. Let me put the wisdom of that aside. But on one legal issue, I want to give you a counter narrative as to what I mean by precedent. So, for example, people said the US invasion of Iraq was illegal because we didn't get a second UN resolution authorizing it. But in 1991, there was an open-ended UN resolution that was Chapter 7, an authorized military force. Now, perhaps it wasn't wise for the United States to cite that. But if you want to take the opposite tact as an international lawyer and say that a pending Chapter 7 resolution didn't apply, that the United States should have gotten a second UN resolution, then what you're doing is setting a precedent of the expiration of UN Security Council resolutions after 12 or 13 years. Then what happens on the Korean Peninsula? Because the Chapter 7 resolution, which allows for UN peacekeepers along the DMZ, is more than 13 years. It's not good enough to say, oh, this was about Iraq, but that's about North Korea, apples and oranges. That's not the way the law works. Likewise, I remember from April 2002, I think at the time, Mary Robinson was the head of the UNHCR, of the Human Rights Commission or the UN Council, whatever the acronym stood for at the time. And they passed a resolution basically arguing that resistance was legal under international law, even violent resistance. Fine. I get the fact that the former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson, didn't like Israel. But if you are saying that car bombing is illegal, if you're saying that car bombing is legal under international law in the West Bank and Gaza, in so-called Palestine, then what you are saying is anyone who claims to be oppressed, it's legal for them to detonate car bombs at schools, improvised explosive devices, shoot civilians, all in the name of resistance. When I go to Australia to lecture, I often see these, and the same thing is true in Canada, these indigenous acknowledgement statements. We acknowledge that the land we are on was once the domain of this native tribe or that native tribe. By acknowledging that, are we suggesting that members of that tribe are occupied and therefore can conduct terrorism legally because of what Mary Robinson decided back in 2002? The point is, if we're going to talk about law, we have to talk about precedent. But so often the human rights activists who want to monopolize law, who want to pretend that their interpretation is the only interpretation, care little about the precedent and the chaos, therefore, that they are leaving in their wake. Now, as I go forward, one of the other problems I have is corruption. I mean, there's the famous case of Human Rights Watch, which, by the way, the founder of Human Rights Watch took to the pages of the New York Times back in 2009 to lament what his organization had become as it had prioritized politics over principle. But we saw Sarah Lee Whitson, for example, who was the head of the Middle East Division, go to Saudi Arabia and basically say, if you donate more money to Human Rights Watch, then we will be more critical of Israel. That's not human rights. That's extortion. That's corruption. And the fact that she wasn't immediately fired suggests that the rot runs deep. There's also the hypocrisy. Look, as I said, I went to a Quaker school. The non-governmental organization of the Quakers is the American Friends Service Committee. In 1947, they won a Nobel Prize, and I think rightly so, because whether they were Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust, or Nazi German prisoners of war. The American Friends Service Committee would check on their medical situation, would give them books to read, that sort of thing. They didn't take a political perspective in helping give assistance to prisoners. Nowadays, however, when we want to look at their Korea programs, how can they work on North Korea but not do anything with South Korea? How can they work in talking about agriculture in North Korea and not pretend that they're helping on a farm which is essentially industrialized slavery with regard to the farmers? I mean, you won't find a word edgewise about North Korea coming from the American Friends Service Committee. Or, as I always point out to my the Quaker school from which I graduated, or that in Washington, Sidwell Friends, where President Obama's children went to school and President Clinton's child went to school. During the Khmer Rouge situation, the Quakers actually said, the American Friends Service Committee actually said, the Khmer Rouge is doing a good thing. They're fighting global capitalism. This is all propaganda that the Khmer Rouge has killed more than 1 million people. I mean, the fact of the matter is, they're using their Nobel Prize, which they got decades before, in order to launder their propaganda, which has everything to do with politics and nothing to do with principle. There's a lot more. One of my favorite books is Gunter Lewis' Peace and Revolution, which talks about, I think he's in his 90s now, he's still alive, a former professor in Utah. And he's described years ago how this corruption has occurred. Another subjectivity example, I spend a lot of my time in Africa. And one of the things I hear is how ridiculous it is when I show up as an American in Central African Republic or Sudan or any of these other places, in Mozambique, that the United States is on one hand preaching against female genital mutilation in terms of promoting feminism and so forth. But on the other hand, is telling us that we have to abide by Western standards of the so-called LGBTQ issues. Well, if you're talking about the T, the transgender, and talking about gender-affirming care, about mutilation, how can you say you're against female genital mutilation, but at the same time promote mutilation of children against their parents' will in favor of so-called human rights? It's pure subjectivity, not objectivity. So the last thing I would say, and in conclusion, is that there are ways forward in this. When I look at what is going on now in our college campuses, I see in the other organization with which I'm affiliated, the Middle East Forum, for which I'm the director of policy analysis, that there's an ongoing effort to utilize American RICO laws, racketeering laws, the same laws that brought down the mafia, the same laws that were used to prosecute Enron and so forth, to allege and to seek through discovery process in courts the linkages which we've already heard between billionaire funders, between organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine, which are really a Hamas front. And when we can actually say this is part of a broader conspiracy, this notion of human rights is actually just a patina. They are corrupt organizations. If we can expose, as you would need to under RICO with the discovery process, where they have to turn over their computers, they have to turn over their books, they have to turn over their bank accounts. I actually think through the courts of real law, of real democracies, that we have a tool moving forward to expose and shame the corruption for what it is. And with that, let me sign off and turn my time back over to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Rubin. That was quite enlightening. We learned a lot from your presentation. Now I invite, just a second, I think next up in line is Samir Kalra, Managing Director of Hindu American Foundation. Samir, go ahead and let's hear your views on CAA and Launtenberg Amendment. Decoding American Hypocrisy.
Great. Thank you so much, Aarti. And thank you to the Indic Researchers Forum for organizing this event. Namaste to everyone. Good evening or good morning early good morning from here in California. It's great to be here with all of you today. Before I get started, I actually wanted to put in a little plug. Michael was talking about some of the funding sources, and the Middle East Forum actually does a fantastic job of tracking funding sources of a lot of the front charitable organizations and how they have manipulated the 501c3 nonprofit system in the US, and how they're using that funding to fund a lot of the activities that we're seeing, a lot of the Islamist groups in particular. So just wanted to get that plug in first before I get started. But today I'm going to really focus my remarks on the Citizenship Amendment Act in the context of the Launtenberg-Specter Amendment, the American reaction to that, and the motivations behind it. So if you recall, in 2019, when the Indian Parliament passed the Citizenship Amendment Act, there was quite a vocal reaction from the American establishment. While some may say it's not surprising, it was perplexing, though, on many levels. If we look at some of the legal precedent, and we also look at some of the similarities in refugee policies between the US and India. In fact, a humanitarian bill such as the CAA should have been welcomed by the US, not just due to the growing bilateral relationship with India, but also given America's long track record of providing shelter and refuge to persecuted communities from around the world, which was very much similar to India's. And after all, the CAA was doing what the US had already been doing for decades, providing a fast-track path to legal status for refugees escaping religious persecution from a very select specific group of countries. The CAA was even more narrowly tailored and limited in scope compared to the similar US policies on refugees and asylum. So for example, the CAA was actually aimed at addressing an already existing refugee crisis, which was created by, of course, the long shadow of partition and exacerbated by subsequent social, religious, and political dynamics in 3 of India's neighboring countries. More specifically, it simply reduced the residency requirement for naturalization and provided a fast-track path to citizenship for the named minorities, Buddhists, Christians, Hindus, Jains, Sikhs, and Zoroastrians, who have, of course, had escaped religious persecution in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, and importantly, were already in India on or before December 31st, 2014. The law had zero and does have zero impact on any existing Indian citizens, whether Muslims or anyone else. So despite the clear intent and scope of the CAA, the reaction and misinformation from many quarters in the US, including government officials, think tanks, the media, academics, and activists, has been quite astounding. In particular, the political fervor to comment and censor India on the CAA, particularly amongst Democrats, but not confined to them, resulted in resolutions from the likes of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, all the way down to local city councils in major cities across the country. These resolutions falsely proclaimed the loss of India's secular fabric and that the CAA posed a risk for Indian Muslims, including the possibility of rendering millions stateless or subject to indefinite detention. The narrative about the CAA has continued at a low level since 2019. Of course, there have been many other issues that India has been attacked on. But again, the announcement earlier this year by the Indian government to notify the rules for the CAA brought renewed criticism from some American policy circles, most notably the State Department, the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is a quasi-government body, and some members of Congress. So what has led to the American criticism of the CAA? Who has been pushing that agenda and why? Before I delve into those questions, I want to first briefly touch on US immigration policy vis-a-vis refugees and asylees, with a particular focus on the Launtenberg-Specter Amendment. If we look at American immigration and asylum and refugee policy, although the framework for refugees and asylee determinations on the surface seems to be consistent and has a consistent framework, the decisions on whether to grant specific asylum to specific applicants or approve large refugee migrations have always been based on highly biased and political decisions, ranging from national security concerns to perceptions or the reality of human rights in particular countries. For example, for many years, the US accepted large numbers of refugees from countries such as Cuba, China, and the former Soviet Union, just to name a few, because of relations with those countries. One of the more prominent examples of such refugee programs is known as the Launtenberg Amendment. What is the Launtenberg Amendment? We've heard that name thrown out a number of times when talking about the CAA. So the Launtenberg Amendment was introduced by former Senator Frank Launtenberg. It was initially passed in 1989 and went into effect in 1990. Like the CAA, it provides a clear immigration path for specific groups of persons fleeing select nations where religious persecution is rampant. Senator Launtenberg created a legal presumption of refugee status, a fast track for certain religious minorities. In other words, unlike other classes of refugees, those coming under the purview of the Launtenberg Amendment did not have to prove that they faced a well-founded fear of persecution if they met certain eligibility requirements. And under the Launtenberg Amendment, the US Refugee Admissions Program allocated admissions among refugees of special humanitarian concern to the United States in accordance with a determination by the President after appropriate consultation. So this family reunification program under the US Refugee Admissions Program allows certain individuals legally residing in the United States to actually apply to bring their family members and friends to the US as refugees. It authorizes citizens of the former Soviet Union to be with their relatives in the US. This is done by granting them presumptive refugee status. The amendment specified that Jews and evangelical Christians from the former Soviet Union, as well as members of the Ukrainian Catholic and Ukrainian Orthodox churches who were experiencing government persecution and discrimination, could utilize the refugee program to seek shelter in the US. So tens of thousands of refugees from the former Soviet Union have come to the US under this program. Now, in 2004, the Launtenberg program was actually expanded even further through what was called the Specter Amendment, spearheaded by former Congressman Arlen Specter. The Specter Amendment allowed religious minorities in Iran to find refuge in the US, including Jews, Christians, Baha'is, Sabian Mandeans, and the Zoroastrians. So Launtenberg, Specter combined together requires that people that want to come into the program show an inability to study or practice religious beliefs or ethnic heritage, or they have been denied access to educational, vocational, or technical institutions from which they would be otherwise qualified, and they have faced some adverse treatment. But again, there's a presumption of that if they meet certain eligibility requirements and have a certain religious identity. And for the purposes of refugees from Iran, the program also requires proof of religious affiliation from one of the minority religions listed in order to qualify. Overall, this Launtenberg Specter program was well-intentioned legislation that arose out of a very specific geopolitical and historical context and was necessary to alleviate the suffering of Jews from the former Soviet Union and religious minorities from Iran, who indeed did face systematic human rights violations and religious persecution. So now let's look a little bit at the Launtenberg Specter versus the CAA. The CAA is no different in that it arose out of a specific geopolitical and historical context and is intended to help a very small group of persecuted religious minorities. And while there are technical differences between these two programs, the humanitarian spirit and intent of both are largely the same. So if one is going to criticize the CAA for leaving out minority Muslim sects from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan from its purview, that same exact criticism can and should also be levied on the Launtenberg Specter program, which has left out Muslims from the former Soviet republics, as well as Iran from qualifying, even though they too have a history of facing discrimination. But both programs raise important points and have left out certain categories of minorities or religious groups for particular reasons. First, Muslims can still immigrate to both the US and India through other means, and in fact have. In India, for instance, of Afghan, Bangladeshi, or Pakistani Muslims seeking Indian citizenship can still enter under normal immigrant and non-immigrant pathways and live in the country for regular residency threshold and apply for citizenship like anyone else. Moreover, Afghan Muslims have been given refuge, while a number of Bangladeshi Muslims were given Indian citizenship after the 2014 settlement of Indo-Bangladesh boundary issues. And in the US, Muslim dissidents from Iran have come to the US as asylees, while Muslims from Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and many other countries have been given refugee status and asylum, not to mention those that arrive on other normal immigrant statuses. Second, and perhaps more importantly, neither the Launtenberg-Specter Amendment nor the CAA have any impact whatsoever on the rights of existing citizens in both countries, particularly Muslim citizens. Then why has there been such a misguided outcry of concern and the false accusation that India has established a religious test for citizenship excluding Muslims, despite the fact that India has not made a single change to the rights of its existing Indian citizens, and the US has a near exact law in place regarding religious refugees? If anything, as I mentioned, the CAA is actually more narrowly tailored and limited in scope compared to the Launtenberg-Specter program. The CAA only applies to 3 countries, while Launtenberg-Specter encompasses refugees from 16 countries. Furthermore, the CAA is limited in time period, meaning that it's only valid to refugees that are already in India prior to December 31st, 2014, which I would argue is actually a flaw and it should be expanded. But the Launtenberg-Specter Amendment actually allows specific refugees to come to the US on an ongoing basis and now has been in effect for 34 years. So why are US policymakers and others commenting on the CAA? Ultimately, it's because that the Democratic Party, the mainstream media, and other analysts have either no regard for facts, which is highly unlikely, or have fallen prey to a sophisticated and systematic lobbying campaign by a highly connected ecosystem of organizations and individuals who use this opportunity to discredit India and undermine US-India relations. And this actually aligns with the interests of some within the US administration itself, including within the State Department, who do not want to see strong relations with India. That's why the rhetoric from some of these groups claiming that the CAA was passed with the express purpose of revoking the citizenship rights of millions of indigenous Indian Muslims was accepted without question. And not surprisingly, many of the groups attacking India for the CAA, including the Council on American Islamic Relations, the US Council of Muslim Organizations, which is an umbrella organization based in Washington, DC, Indian American Muslim Council, Islamic Circle of North America, and many others are the same ones now organizing anti-Israel campaigns, undermining US-Israel relations, and engaging in grotesque anti-Semitism. Not far behind are the far left Indian Marxist groups, such as Hindus for Human Rights, and even some purportedly mainstream Sikh organizations like Sikh Coalition and Sikh American Legal Defense Fund, who harbor Khalistan sympathies, have attacked India for the CAA. Ironically, despite the fact that the CAA benefits persecuted Sikhs from Afghanistan and Pakistan. Notably, Hindus for Human Rights and these Sikh groups have also supported anti-Israel and anti-Semitic activism going on currently on college campuses. The US policy establishments needs to wake up and recognize that the same ideological compunctions that have driven the anti-CAA lobbying campaign have now pivoted to focusing on Israel. This ideology and the groups that are spearheading it are hurting US domestic interests as well as harming countries such as Israel and India. Instead of focusing on humanitarian laws in India, policymakers need to confront this ideological initiative, both from within the establishment and outside of it. If US government officials do want to comment on or take a position on an issue like the CAA, they should first take a look in the mirror and change the Launtenberg-Specter Amendment and other refugee policies domestically. Otherwise, they should respect the internal policy decisions of a democratic, pluralistic ally like India and keep quiet. And with that, thank you very much, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Samir. That was really educational. I didn't really know anything about Launtenberg Amendment, and thanks for educating us about it. Now I invite Major General G.D. Bakshi. He'll be speaking on caste and national security, Western intervention in India's social fabric. Sir, over to you. Sir, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now? Hello.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
All right. All right. So, as I said, it is a pleasure indeed to interact with such a erudite group of scholars, and I am very close to Rajiv Malhotra. I miss him. Unfortunately, he had to leave. But the topic that I am going to address today, and without much ado, I'd like to come straight to the point, is the question of hostile countries, foreign interest, trying to once again exploit the caste fault lines in the Indian societal fabric, right? A little bit of context and history is called for. There is no term like caste in any Indian language. Get that right. I say that again, there is no term like caste in any Indian languages. Caste is a term that comes from the Portuguese word casta. And the Portuguese who had come in the 17th century, well, they had given this kind of a designation to what they saw as jati and varna stratifications in Indian society. Now, jati and varna are not frozen in stone kind of divisions. There was mobility, upward, downward mobility, depending upon your innate inclinations, your skill sets, your, wanting to, there was a mobility in your, the kind of jobs that you did and you chose to do. But this mobility started freezing in the Muslim period, in the Islamic invasions that began in earnest, I'm saying, from the 10th century to the 16th century. We've had one invasion after the other, Afghan invasions, Turkic invasions, Mongol invasions, Turkic Mongol or Mughal invasions, etc., followed by Nadir Shah, right? One invasion after another. Over a period of time, thank God for India's strategic depth, that it could not be overrun. And the amazing factor is that despite almost 3 centuries of Islamic rule, India is one of the few countries where the population, 80% of it till now, has remained Hindu. It did not convert en masse. How did that happen? Like I said, one was because of the strategic depth that India had. Even while the Muslim invaders were coming in from the north, the Chola Empire in the south was expanding towards Southeast Asia. So it took a couple of centuries before they could really subjugate the whole of India, get into South India proper, where the Vijayanagar Empire put up heroic resistance. And, that kind of a situation it was. The other fact was that when the Hindu political states in the north were largely destroyed, their military power destroyed, the the Hindu community had no other option. Their last line of defense was their jati, their varna, their khap, their panchayat, right? And they'd always had a level of autonomy in local affairs, managing their village affairs. They had an ecosystem in which one jati supported the other. And now this became their last line of defense against very aggressive proselytization, conversion by the sword, etc. So India proved to be a weak state then, but a strong society. And, you found that with the threat of excommunication of anybody who converted, with the threat of stopping what is called roti beti ka rishta, giving daughters in marriage or dining together. With these threats of excommunication and even exile, the village communities were the last line of defense of Hinduism. That is the time when jati and caste became a little more ossified, rigid, and they became hereditary. But then came the British. After the uprising of 1857, the British East India Company was shaken up. It was a very bloody uprising. And unfortunately for us, had the entire 80,000 to 100,000 British Indian sepoys, had they revolted together, the Raj would have been history. but their revolts were sporadic. They were not well coordinated. There was no central authority. The Indian sepoys lacked higher command military experience. They were only up to the level of NCOs. And therefore, this uprising, the British were able to suppress by playing one Indian race against the other. For example, the British had conquered Punjab using the Purbaiya Sipahis of Bengal, Awadh, that is Bihar, and eastern Uttar Pradesh. They were called the Bhaiyas by the Sikhs. And they were very resentful of the fact that they had been beaten on the battlefield by the Bhaiyas. So when the 1857 revolt took place, the British used the Sikhs, the Punjabi Muslims, against the Purbaiya Sipahis, right? And then they used the hill tribes against the plains, and they exploited every single fault line. And they were able to suppress this uprising with a surprising amount of brutality, amazing degree of brutality, which will almost border on genocide, right? And by the way, you know, in the British era, we had 7 man-made famines. This was a new form of genocide created. There was a fiat given to the Indian farmers, they will not grow food crops, they will grow opium for sale to China. What do you think it did to the people of India? Led to famines. The last great famine out of the 7 came with the East Bengal famine in 1943. 3.5 million Indians perished there, right? 3.5 million. If you take an average of 3 million Indians dying in each famine, that makes 21 million Indians. That is a genocide about 4 times, 5 times as large as the Jewish Holocaust in World War II. So, you know, there are various aspects to this entire colonial historiography that we have been inflicted with. But after the 1857 revolt was suppressed, the British, firstly, the Crown took charge of the colony. The British East India Company was history now. And the British set to with a will to identify every single fault line in Indian society that could be used to prevent a coming together. They were shocked by how all the different ethnicities, castes and creeds of India had come together to fight the British. So they set about with a will to identify every single fault line. Their anthropologists worked overtime. And one of the top anthropologists in British India was Herbert Hume Risley, Sir Herbert Risley. He was the head of the Anthropological Society of India, and he did one of the most to study the Indian society. But he did not just study it. He carried out social engineering to freeze castes as permanent social divisions forever and ever. You know, he identified 2,743 different castes in India. I mean, and it was a very arbitrary kind of a analysis of what constitutes a caste, what constitutes a jati, and he said there are about 47 different races in India, you know. And then with a series of caste censuses, the first caste census was done in 1872. With this caste census, he tried to now freeze his understanding of caste, impose it onto the Indian society through these caste censuses. How was that done? They had elaborate forms, so elaborate that the census, people conducting the census, the British officials had to go around explaining these caste categories to the Indians and forcing them to force fit themselves into any one of these so that the British Empire would deal with them only on the basis of this categorization. One of the ridiculous indexes was nose length. Nose length, if you please. You know, I mean, it has ridiculous anomalies like that. But by repeated decadal caste censuses, they ensure that every Indian was shown his place on the caste hierarchy, was designated, this is what you are, buddy, we will deal with you only in these categories. So Risley carried out a social engineering of India to make caste permanent fault lines. right? And the amazing fact is that as a society industrializes, as a society urbanizes, caste divisions become increasingly irrelevant anachronisms, right? They become increasingly irrelevant because nobody can really practice them. Imagine you are going in a metro. Can you ask the next person sitting to you what his caste is and what it is? He would smack you on the face. So these were becoming irrelevant. But the British gave it a lease of life, which was to divide and rule. And let me quote Risley, who said, and I quote, as long as there is caste, there will be no India. I say that again. As long as there is caste, there will be no India. It was a social stratification exercise imposed upon the Indian society, imposed upon the Indian body politic by a vicious social engineering program that lasted almost a century. And its aim was to make caste divisions permanent, so that divide and rule, divide et impera could now be practiced by 2,743 different Indian castes and about 47 different Indian races. My God, you know, and they went further. They just didn't confine themselves. They found the largest majority was 90% Indians were Hindus, so they went after the Hindu body politic, fragmented it into the lines of thousands of castes. And then, of course, there were the creedal differences. They had a separate electorate for the Muslims, separate for the Sikhs, separate for the Christians, separate for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And in post-independence India, all these separate electorates have at one time or the other, been the basis of violent insurgencies, breakaway movements from India. Sikh separatism, we can see it happening even today. The Muslims, they got their Pakistan. They made sure India was partitioned. And then, of course, the Christian insurgencies we have been seeing in the Northeast, where that entire area had been, converted, and that was used to try and hive them off. The scheduled castes and scheduled tribes were given separate electorate to see that they would no longer, they could be hived off from the Hindu society. And today we have in Harvard the Afro-Dalit concept, atrocity literature being built up to divide and deepen these caste fault lines. I'm sorry, the fault also lies with us, with our pygmy post-independence India politicians who could, because of lack of ability to find out other topics to mobilize society, they fell back onto the British invention of caste. And Indian politics post-independence has been dominated by caste. There is a trend that I would like to point out to you. Very few people really are conscious of this trend post-independence. The biggest nightmare was that India would get partitioned. People like Subhash Chandra Bose had tried to keep Indian Hindus and Muslims together in their fight against the colonial empire. But once the British, partitioned India, and our politicians tamely accepted it, Nehru, Gandhi tamely accepted it, they still now try to tell their balance electorate, their Muslim electorate, that, look, we will be secular, we will safeguard you, we will keep India secular. And their definition of keeping India secular was to make sure that the majority Hindu community was splintered on the lines of caste, on the fault lines of caste, into separate electoral vote banks. So these separate electoral vote banks became on par with the Muslim vote bank. And they went out of the way to cultivate that Muslim vote bank as a permanent kind of a electoral asset. You see, India chose to be a democracy based on universal adult suffrage, universal adult voting rights. men, women, everybody was given this right. And there were a lot of fears expressed that the level of literacy then was just 35%. And how can you run a massive democracy like that without literacy? But it worked just fine. But the unfortunate flip side was that the politicians used caste as a political mobilization tool. And then the struggle that we found was there were two parallel movements. One was the Hindu far right movement to try and consolidate the 80 to 90% Hindu electorate. And, because in any normal democratic dispensation, the majority would assert itself. They would win the majority. The dominant demography of the Hindus would constitute most of the governments. I mean, that is by democratic principles. That is when the idea of India that was entertained by Nehru and co. They tried to create a version of secularism in which the Hindus were virtually disenfranchised. They were prevented from ever having a political consolidation. Very few people understand this. And what was the primary card that they used to prevent a Hindu political consolidation in India, in the democracy, 80% majority coming together? Well, they used the card of caste. Now, look, what I'm trying to say is, I'm not getting into majoritarian kind of politics, but what I'm saying is that the bulk of United States, the population is Christian. Bulk of European states, the population is Christian. The American president swears on the Bible, right? And that's not an anathema. That doesn't go against secularism per se. No attempt has been made to split the Christian majority in the United States or in Europe along denominational lines of, Catholics, Protestants, and whatever you, to ensure that the smaller minorities are not outvoted. But in India, this was a very specific exercise, and they tried more or less to revive the Mughal Empire. Amazing as it sounds, but that is the fact. They said India's glory, civilizational glory, is confined to the Mughal Empire. And therefore, the tourism circuit built in post-independence India was Taj Mahal, the Agra Fort, the Red Fort, Fatehpur Sikri. That is all that India had to showcase. That is all that India had to showcase to the West, to other tourists coming from outside. And that was to give a degree of comfort to the Muslim minority. Look, I mean, you returned back to the Mughal era of the Mughal Raj. Nehru is the new Grand Mughal, and he will give you the independence of India address from the ramparts of the Red Fort, where the last Mughal emperor had reigned. Where the last Mughal emperor had, ruled. So the problem is, our politicians in India have compounded the British legacy by hanging on to caste. And now that India is a rising power, now that India has come from the 10th largest economy to the 5th largest economy, it's headed for the 3rd. India is a space power of consequence. India is a major military power. 2nd largest army, 4th largest air force, 5th largest navy, right? We are a nuclear power. So we see the Huntington kind of a project now trying to, despite the fact that we have great congruities of interest, geostrategic interest between India and the United States, especially vis-a-vis China. But yet we find that there is a kind of a segment of the state in the USA itself, which is working to, support the academia, the NGOs, who are working to destabilize India through these caste coalitions. Turnout, atrocity, literature, equate the Dravidians, the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes with the Africans, with the Africans, Americans in the United States, and say that the Brahmin so-called white majority is suppressing them, to sort of conflate, equate the two situations which are just not related in any way. But the whole thing is to use the caste fault lines which the British exploited to divide and rule India, now to divide India, weaken India, breaking India forces, I'm afraid they are active. And in the latest election, you see these two contra trends in Indian society, at play. Modi, he was able to carry out a political consolidation of the Hindu society, Hindu vote by 2014 in a major way. 29, he reinforced it. He's now seeking a third term. What is the opposition coming up with? Caste censuses. Like Risley had held caste censuses, they want to hold caste censuses, create a communism of caste. Evaluate your wealth and then give it away. I'm sorry, we are not becoming a commie state. We are not going to turn into a communist state with the communism of caste, however much some parties would like to ram it down. India has never had those communist leanings. We had a strong Marxist lobby, very disruptive, vocal, very small minority, but extremely vocal. And most of the time, the tail wagged the dog, especially in the Nehruvian era. They took charge of our academic establishment, lock, stock, and barrel. And now, they are trying to work onto this communism of caste kind of a equation to try and disenfranchise the Hindu majority from attaining its possibly what in any democratic dispensation would have been a natural process. Well, the majority rules. The majority rules. And it is lucky that the Hindus are a very tolerant majority. That is why we have suffered so much. It's not what we did to others, but what was done to us, which has shaken us up. And now we are just being protective. Yes, there are, some who would criticize some of the those who are carried away, who are almost giving Hinduism kind of a look of the Abrahamic faith. That is not what Hinduism is. It is a very tolerant religion. It says, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. It is the most democratic faith. The truth is one. The wise call him by many names. And when you talk of the infinity of Brahman, everything is contained in that infinity. Hinduism is like the Wikipedia. Anybody is free to edit, to write, to delete. Right? So we are a democratic faith. And all that is that the dominant demography, can it get political power? Well, it got political power in the last two elections. That is now being seriously contested. And contested with what? With the British legacy of fracturing, dividing, breaking up the Hindu majority into incoherent caste fragments so that the minorities can have a disproportionate say. The minorities could wag the dog. The tail could wag the dog, would have a say far beyond their numbers. And, I'm not talking of discriminating against the minorities, but I'm saying let the natural processes of democracy work naturally. You see, they can't be, the only way you can enforce secularism in India is by disenfranchising the Hindu majority. That, I'm afraid, is undemocratic. That, I'm afraid, is undemocratic. We were told for quite some time, look, the Muslims came, they destroyed your temples. Lord Ram, the most revered God in the Indian pantheon, if his temple was destroyed, it will stay destroyed to preserve communal harmony in the present. Even if you negotiate in this, it will not be reconstructed. Well, it has been reconstructed. We had a very amicable situation. The Muslims were given land and they are coming up with a very grand mosque. So, in the Indian dispensation, it is, Sarva Dharma Samabhava. We respect all religions equally. The state cannot become atheist in trying to prove its secular credentials. That is something, it is too religious society, the Indian dispensation. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the constant use of the caste card to fracture, disintegrate, separate Indian society into incoherent fragments is disruptive of national unity, national coherence, national power. It'll constantly keep India squabbling amongst its 2,743 castes as defined not by us, but by Sir Herbert Hope Risley. God bless his soul, but the amount of damage that he has done to the Indian civilization is perhaps incalculable. I think I'd leave it for here, and if there are Q&As, then I can address those issues separately. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that excellent presentation. Now I'm opening the floor for Q&A. If there are any listeners who have questions, I can read out the questions. And in fact, I myself have a few questions, but let me read out the question that has come from the audience. I was just saying this. Where are the questions? There's a question for Major General Bakshi. Sir, how do we balance between merit and welfare of the real marginalized communities in India? There is no concept of left in the sport. How do we achieve excellence and at the same time look after the
Your voice was breaking, but I think I've gotten the drift of the question. How do we ensure merit? We are not ensuring merit. We are driving out our merit to the United States and to Europe. The bulk of our IIT graduates, our IIM graduates are making a beeline for the United States. They're doing damn well there because they are bright people. But the fact of that when they emigrate to the United States, their services are not available to us in India. And we have had to make do with the second best mostly. We have destroyed merit. Affirmative action has been pushed to absurd lengths in India. The real people, if you ask me frankly, who deserve affirmative action are the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. They are the poorest of our poor. They deserve it. Now you spread the affirmative action, profile to the other backward castes, OBCs. And there you have reached a ridiculous situation where 70% reservations are being enacted in many states of India. What does that amount to? Reverse discrimination for the 30%. Then we are trying after independence to create a pan-Indian identity. This whole thing of reservations creates sub-identities which militate against the national identity, right? Against homogeneity. Very badly militate. And they are the reasons of insurgencies and terrorist movements and everything are focused by, are fueled by these fault lines, if I may so put it. So what is the way out? I think the way out simple is to dump this caste construct altogether, and we do affirmative action based upon pure economic criteria. If you are below the poverty line, the state should help you, I would say, regardless of caste, creed, religion, whatever. If you are poor, the Indian state will help you. But you can't be that a person has reached the rank of secretary or a general and his children still ask for reservation. I think that is ridiculous. That is ridiculous. It really takes away the benefits of affirmative action from those who need it the most. That is what we have done. We've run riot. Our politicians have run riot with caste. Run riot. And over a period of time, I think it is not to India's long-term future growth and prospects that we should let this caste cancer hang around for much longer. We should shift to economic criteria for affirmative action of any time, whether reservation in educational institutions or jobs. Now people want promotions, reservations even in promotions. How ridiculous can you get? And how long will this supposed to last? 10,000 years? I mean, what nonsense. It's about time that we stopped. I mean, it sounds like Alice in Wonderland. I'm sure it does to our foreign friends here.
I
But
think
it has to be come to an end.
I think we all would agree with that point of view, sir. Let me put this. There's a question for Mr. Michael Rubin. Sir, considering the increasing fragmentation and polarization in international relations, along with the decline in multilateralism, do you observe a trend towards hyper partisanship in international bodies that were previously considered neutral? How might this impact global governance and international cooperation? That's the question for you.
Yes, I'll try to answer very briefly. First, within the United States context, not the multilateral context, I think the trend we're seeing with the hyperpartisanship in the United States, when people talk about Trump or Biden or any of the extremes, is that we're seeing the erosion of the faith which Americans have in our institutions. First, it was the media. Then it was the courts. Now, the U.S. military, which was once seen as spanning American parties and so forth, is becoming degraded by this partisanship. So to the question, I think the same trend is existing, but it is worse in international organizations because quite simply isn't the level of accountability with international organizations. I mean, if we want to add on to what the Major General said just on the macro level, when you are appointing people to international organizations based simply on their nationality, and when that appointment depends on them being in the good graces of whatever the morally repugnant elite are in China, in Pakistan, and what have you, then what you actually get are institutions which have completely turned their back on the principles on which they were founded and simply become mechanisms to further state ambitions, but laundered through the through this notion that somehow they are more altruistic. Unfortunately, the complete discrediting. I mean, sorry, one example would just be the World Health Organization, which seems to put health aside in favor of what China, whatever political or diplomatic agenda China might have with regard to Taiwan or what have you. I mean, let's face it, the birds that carry bird flu don't give a hoot about Taiwan versus China. And therefore, if you are trying to filter policy through that diplomatic construct, you're completely delegitimizing the international institution. Unfortunately, that's the trend we're seeing. So let me turn the floor back.
All right. That is a very candid observation. Samir, there's a question for you. With the breakdown of traditional media and echo chambers, how do you envision for a better people-to-people interaction between India and America to a greater mutual understanding and better future cooperation?
Sure. So I'll speak purely from the American perspective, since that's, kind of where I'm based and I can speak better to. But I think the key lies with the diaspora, with the Indian American diaspora. I think the diaspora has played an important role in improving U.S.-India relations historically in America. But the diaspora now is also becoming much more active at all levels of the U.S. So there was, I would say, probably in the last 10 to 15 years, too much of a focus on the federal level, on Congress, on trying to, to build relationships at that level. But where you see the diaspora playing out more and being more active now and understanding where real change can actually be fostered is at the local and state level, because a lot of these misconceptions trickle down to local and city and state levels. And also not just with policymakers, but educating and building relationships with those that enforce policy. An example I'll give here is that we talk about, the Khalistan issue, for instance. Now, it's one thing to talk to, policymakers that may be introducing resolutions on transnational repression or are not understanding the Khalistan issue. but it's even more important to actually talk to organizations like the Department of Justice, to talk to local law enforcement that are actually going to see Khalistan activities play out at a local level. And so I think in order to foster that greater awareness and understanding of India, of issues pertaining to India, there has to be engagement by the diaspora. The diaspora has to lead the way at all levels of governance in the US. I think the other thing that I would suggest is that what other communities have done well, and the Jewish community has done a really good job of, is to support and sponsor trips. So trips taking policymakers from America to Israel, to take trips of journalists from the US to Israel, to take local city council officials, law enforcement, other think tanks, etc., to Israel to better understand the facts on the ground. So this is something I think we need to see transitioning here, where Indian organizations or Hindu organizations need to start supporting those types of trips and trying to support that engagement. So instead of just seeing what you hear in the New York Times or Washington Post or from your Ilhan Omars, they can actually go on the ground in India, meet with various stakeholders, get a better understanding of the ground realities and what's actually happening there, as opposed to hearing it from secondary and tertiary sources, and then hopefully applying that to how they govern in the US.
All right. There's another question for General Bakshi. Sir, the damage which has been caused by insurgencies in the Northeast, because of which the development schemes have not reached them and have also kept them away from mainstream. How do you look at this? Sir, unmute yourself. Sir, could you hear my question? So can you unmute yourself?
Acha. Can I just have the question again? There was some disturbance.
Yes, I can read it out again to you. The damage caused by insurgencies in the Northeast resulted in not, accessing development schemes, and that has also kept the Northeast away from mainstream. How do you look at this?
No, I'm afraid I don't quite agree. Especially the present administration has made, I think, all-out efforts to try and not only look east, act east, and try and develop linkages with Southeast Asia, trade corridors, shipping ports, build up the infrastructure for export, import, so that that area is brought up. The British policy was to keep the tribes isolated from mainstream India. Absolutely, there was an inner line permit you had to have to go to the Northeast. You weren't, the ordinary normal Indians weren't allowed to go there, the so-called plainsmen, because under a very fancy anthropological notion that those pure innocent races would be spoilt by the more exploitative kind of people, traders, etc., going from there. All that is history. We are making specific efforts to reach out to the Northeast to develop, the populations there. They have a tremendous amount of innate talent, and a number of them are even going to Japan because of that that racial coherence, the ethnic kind of closeness, proximity. The Japanese are helping us a lot in trying to develop that area. Yes, there are problems. There are old insurgencies which were started in the 1950s. Some of them have been resolved, like in Mizoram is now totally peaceful, but Nagaland is also relatively more peaceful. Manipur, unfortunately, there was no one single insurgent group that we could talk to. They had splintered into so many. So therefore, you have to strike separate deals, and we are trying to get to get them to be join the mainstream. And I think they will. Things have turned around quite a lot there because of the development of infrastructure, the development of opportunities, the more education reaching that place. They are very creative, very innovative people. Thank you.
There is one more question for Mr. Rubin. Neo-Marxism masquerading as woke culture has destroyed family system in the US, which forms the basis of society. How does Western civilization cope with the issue of woke policies of the government, illegal migration to the West, which possesses a civilizational security challenge to the West?
Thank you. It's a good question. Let me dispense with the theoretical jargon and just answer it directly. I agree with the questioner. I'm not the only one. If we want to go back to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was quite an intellectual senator, a diplomat, a Democrat, he had spoken about the long-term 50 years ago, he had written about and spoken about the long-term implications of the breakdown of the nuclear family. And I think we're paying that price right now. So the answer to that question is yes. The breakdown of the family is having a tremendous impact on the cohesiveness of society today.
Okay, so are there any solutions? Do you see a way out?
Let me put it this way. While I consider myself a liberal, a traditional liberal, and I consider myself a feminist, a traditional feminist, we need to recognize that when some of these theories go too far, when they try to establish themselves as a substitute for religion, as a substitute for family, as a substitute for community, that itself is a negative. And that's ultimately something that a backlash of voters in a democracy need to address. I live in suburban Washington, D.C., in Maryland right now, and it's something which we see, for example, in the school system. Who should have the predominance in the education, in the values with which our children are educated? Should it be the teachers' unions and some unnamed bureaucrat, or should it be the families? I think now we're seeing a backlash that it should be a family. If I can put on my American political analyst hat for a second, I would argue that that backlash would be further along if we didn't have the polarization of, frankly, of Donald Trump, because many people that might react negatively and push back on the big government tendencies of the Democrats aren't willing to abandon the Democratic Party because of the polarization which Donald Trump thrives on. That said, I think that's a temporary speed bump. But ultimately, once Trumpism is flushed by our system, and it's going to be flushed from our system by too many cheeseburgers, too many bacon, strips of bacon, cholesterol, and so forth on Donald Trump himself, then ultimately, I think we're going to get back to a backlash against this big government approach. And look, it's part of the American character. We can talk about ideology, neo-Marxism, and stuff like that, but ultimately, Americans tend to be very, very distrustful of government. And that ultimately is something which the Europeans don't understand when it comes to the European partisan divide. The Americans are distrustful of government. We want to put the individual first, and this is leading the backlash right now, as the general said with regard to affirmative action. It's leading the backlash against affirmative action right now in the United States. And honestly, I think the shock and the delegitimization of what we've seen in our elite universities over the last couple months, the complete implosion of the brand name of Harvard, of the brand name of Columbia, where people aren't willing to hire these graduates anymore, the willingness of universities to scrap diversity, whatever DEI stands for, those diversity statements are now being scrapped not only by public universities, by private universities. I think we're actually starting to see the return to common sense because we've looked over the precipice and seen what happens when we abandon individualism, when we abandon family values in favor of some unaccountable administrators' values. At Yale University, I'm sorry, my alma mater at Yale College, there is now a ratio of 1 administrator to every student. That's something which is driving the backlash as well. But let me give the floor back.
Thank you. I think we are almost I think we are already way ahead of the time that was allotted to us. And let's summarize what I have gathered from all the presentations today. I think Mr. Malhotra gave us, in fact, he highlighted the root cause of, or probably not just the root cause, but the multiple forces from where polarization is emerging, from where the forces of weaponization are operating, and in so many different nexuses and in so many different dimensions. I think from what I gathered from Mr. Rubin's presentation is that at the core of all these forces which are operating in multiple dimensions as well as multiple continents is corruption. And what he really focused on is that nation states, especially democracies, need to strengthen laws. We could have a good debate on how to strengthen those laws and how to overcome the arbitrariness of exercising those laws, as Samir, in fact, in his presentation also pointed out, highlighted how a Launtenberg amendment itself is being arbitrarily used with certain agendas that are being fulfilled with certain goals. I think I'm really grateful to General Bakshi for giving us the overview of the British weaponization of caste in India and how Risley's model of caste divisions is now, in fact, being implemented by the opposition in India, where, in a way, Indian political parties, Indian political entities are themselves weaponizing caste or weaponizing these demographic differences to further their own political agendas. These are very complex issues at one level and very simple at another level. But I think debate is always welcome, because debate gives us insight to see how we can collectively uh, resolve these issues and how we can collectively confront these issues. I think one word of appreciation for Middle East Forum, as Samir also pointed out, that Middle East Forum actually goes and tries to track the source of funding for such polarization and weaponization of ideas and individuals, and also in effect breaking down the social fabric across the world. Thank you so much for presenting your points of view, and thank you for a great audience which was not only listening very well but also posed some very interesting and fascinating questions. Thank you, everyone, once again. I'm handing it over to the forum itself. If you have any other further points to make, please go ahead, Yashas.
Okay, ma'am. Aparna, please deliver your concluding remarks.
Okay, sir, sure. With this, we have come to the end of our last session. I would like to thank the session chair, Aarti Tikoo Singh, and Dr. Michael Rubin, Samir Kalra, Rajiv Malhotra, Major General G.D. Bakshi for this very important discussion. It is indeed a privilege for all of us to hear from such an eminent panel. With this, we have come to an end of our conference. I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone on behalf of Indic Researchers Forum, to all the speakers, session chairs, and audience for patiently attending this conference. All those who have attended at least 4 sessions, kindly revert to hr.indicrif@gmail.com with your email ID and full name for the participation certificate. Once again, thank you all for joining.